Very good morning to you. And we start the show with some breaking news this morning. The latest retail sales figures show a rise of 0.3%. We'll bring you more details on that a little bit later this morning. But first to our top story. And a day after strikes cut off swathes of the country's rail network, and a day before that happens again, London transport workers are walking out today in a dispute over pay and pensions. Tube and overground services are either cancelled or barely running, and a coinciding bus strike is disrupting dozens of routes in the capital. Well, across the country, rail commuters are dealing with delays from the knock-on effects of yesterday's national strikes. In London, more than 10,000 London Underground and Overground workers are amongst those striking today, leaving lines running sparsely or in some cases not at all. The bus strike today and tomorrow will cancel 57 routes, mainly through West and South West London, as well as Surrey. And Saturday will see a repeat of Thursday's UK-wide rail strikes, with about 40,000 workers taking part. Well, I'm joined now by the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. Grant Shapps, a very good morning to you. Good to have you on the programme. Let's talk about strikes then, shall we? Because once again, we're suffering from them here in London on the Underground and bus services. We've got rail strikes across the country again tomorrow. Why has this not been resolved?
I think essentially now because the union bosses won't put the settlement deals to their members. So we've had a situation where 8% over 2 years has been offered. It's different depending on which piece of the rail we're talking about here, but broadly speaking. And the bosses, for example, the boss of the RMT, simply make the decision without going out to their membership to ask them whether they would like to settle this and get back to work. Where it has gone to the members, that was in a smaller union called the TSSA, the members overwhelmingly voted for that deal, over 70%. So it's quite clear that the union bosses are trying to prevent the workers from actually have the offer put in front of them.
Well, yeah, you say it's all down to the union bosses, and you've really come out fighting on this, haven't you, as far as the unions are concerned. You published a 16-point plan as well about taking on the unions, but don't most people just want a resolution? They want to see you talking to the unions yourself. They want a more conciliatory tone. Have you got this wrong?
Yeah, so it's for the employers and the unions to discuss this, obviously, because they're the only two who can settle it. Indeed, they've been in discussion, and I think what is a very reasonable pay offer has been made. Remember that the average rail worker, the median, is £44,000. So that's the average salary. On a train driver, and the train drivers are also out on strike with a separate union, their average is nearly £60,000. So I'm all in favour of well-paid rail workers who received a huge amount of support from your viewers, the taxpayers, during coronavirus, to the tune of £16 billion or £600 for every household watching your programme. So the public has supported the railway and the railway workers. It's time for the union bosses to get out the way and put the deals on the table to their members so we can have this thing settled. And the point about my 16-point plan, which is really to look at the union legislation and see if it's in the right place, is really to hand that power back to the rail workers, or workers across the whole economy, actually, not just in rail, rather than have it sit with some of these union bosses who, in some cases, including the RMT boss, say they hanker for the days of union baron power from the 1970s. We don't need that kind of industrial relations. We just need to have this thing settled.
Well, we do need to have this thing settled, and the union bosses would say that the offer that's on the table falls way below inflation. And when a lot of people sympathise with that, there are a lot of people around the country who are facing inflation outstripping their own wages. And isn't it the case that a lot of people will have sympathy with those railway workers when they're not tempted to take an offer that's below inflation?
I think we're all concerned that, everyone would have sympathy with the inflation argument. And, let's remember it's the supply chain recovering after coronavirus. It's Putin going to war in Ukraine that's caused this global inflation spike. But the offer on the table is pretty decent for, as I say, the average train worker on 44,000, the average driver on £60,000. A government's got to sort of balance that with, nurses who are paid 31,000 or care workers 21,000. I think it's important that we balance that across the economy. Of course, everyone would love for it to be more. In fact, one of the good things for the railways is some of the reforms required, some of the modernizations are so out of date. For example, paper timesheets being used still on the maintenance side in some cases, maintenance teams not allowed to be sent from, for example, Euston to King's Cross because the RMT claims that 5-minute walk puts them in two different regions and you can't therefore use the maintenance teams. And so many other examples means that there are actually a lot of modernizations that can help fund some of these pay increases. But as I say, the big block is that these union bosses refuse to allow the offer on the table to be put to their members. It's one of the reasons in my 16-point plan to tackle the unions that I'm saying that in future it should be the case that union members have to put proper offers to their membership rather than blocking them at union executive or union baron level.
So you're saying that the unions are blocking progress, that Mick Lynch of the RMT says that you're the obstacle to progress, and he says the government's bailing out companies to enable them to continue working during strikes. He's also suggesting the government's backing compulsory redundancy. So are you?
Well, the deal on the table, actually, for the RMT, particularly on the Network Rail side, as I say, it's slightly complicated here because there are several different negotiations in play across the railway. But the deal that's on the table actually means largely no compulsory redundancies at all. Again, if you're not prepared to put that deal to your membership, we'll never know whether the members would accept it. What I do know, and I can say for sure, is if we can't get this settled in the way that we're proposing, which is please put the deal to your membership, then we will have to move to what's called a Section 188. This is a process of actually requiring these changes to go into place so it becomes mandated. And that is the direction that this is moving in now. So these reforms, these modernizations, some of which update rules that go back to the 50s, 60s and 70s. One, which is the inability for us to run a service properly on a Sunday without people volunteering, so we can't contractually put this in place, goes back 100 years, over 100 years. If we can't get those modernizations in place, we will have to impose those modernizations, but we'd much rather do it through these offers actually being put to their members.
Steve White is the managing director of South Eastern Railway. He's frustrated. He's tweeted actually saying, does any railway colleague or customer really want this to last for months? It's time for a ceasefire. Our people deserve a pay rise and job security. So he's calling there for a pay rise. He says our industries exist to serve our customers and community. More talks are needed, then some more and then some more. You should be round the table, shouldn't you, sorting this out now?
Well, the people who have to be round the table are the employers and the workers' representatives, in this case, the unions. They're the only people who can settle this strike. Of course, government sets the mandate overall because we have the further wider responsibility for not just how much rail workers are paid, but how much care workers are paid, how much staff in the NHS, doctors and nurses, and police, and so many other public services. So, of course, we have to set an overall framework. The Treasury has done that. In a way, as I say, rail is fortunate. There is so much modernisation required for work practices which have no place in the 21st century at all. I'll give you a good example of this. Is there are the same number of ticket offices, more or less, than there were when virtually all the tickets were sold at ticket offices. We want to get people out from behind the glass and onto the stations helping customers. Sorry
to interrupt you, but you're saying this has got nothing to do with the government. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to move this on.
And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the government has to set the overall mandate, the framework, but the technical discussions have to take place between the employers and the unions. And they have been. And that's why we've got offers of 8% over 2 years on the table with, as I say, it varies depending on which part of which union and which part of the railway we're talking about, but no compulsory redundancies, for example, with the Network Rail maintenance side, and much more. If the unions won't put the offer to their members, I'm afraid we will have to impose some of these solutions, and that's where we're moving to now.
OK, Talking about solutions, Labour has called for the government to restore Avanti West Coast services after they've announced a reduced service. We've got Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, talking to us a little bit later on. So tell us what you're doing about this. What action are you going to take?
Well, it's a bit pot kettle black because the problem on Avanti West Coast, which is to do with the ASLEF union calling unofficial action, and they voted for action short of strikes, so we know that is the case, has meant that they withdrawn voluntary day working. It actually exemplifies everything that's wrong about the way that the railway is being run, that rather than contractually running our railway, we have volunteer days to do it. And we had a 90% drop 3 days after the union voted to withdraw to do everything short of striking. So we know it must be connected to that ballot, which meant that Avanti West Coast can no longer run a reliable service. So when you have Andy Burnham on, I hope you're going to ask him, since he takes money from the unions, when he's going to tell his friends in the unions to get this sorted out and stop playing games with people's lives. The only reason they're not running a service is because of those unions, and they are demonstrating why the railway is so desperately in need of reform. And as I say, we will bring in that reform. My 16-point plan, which I've no doubt the new government, the new administration will be adopting, will in fact bring this reform if the unions aren't going to settle it any other way.
Is this really about strikes? Isn't this about train companies just not having the drivers that they need? And he would say to you, no doubt, are you going to withdraw the franchise if they don't come up with some solution to this?
The solution's been there all along, right? So ordinarily...
They don't have enough drivers, though, to cover their shifts.
Well, hold on a second. Ordinarily, and this is because we have this extraordinary situation on our railways where what's called rest day working or overtime is what's used in many cases to run services. So to give you an example on Northern, clearly here on the West Coast, quite a lot of the service has to be filled by people simply volunteering to work those days. Any normal contract would say that you're contractually required to work on certain days, up to a certain number of hours, of course. We don't have that on large parts of our railway, which is crazy. And it's one of the things that we're trying to change, to modernise our railway. Just because in 1919 Sundays were protected as a rest day where no one ever worked, does no longer fit with the 21st century, where actually, particularly post-coronavirus, more people are travelling for leisure. So more people are travelling on Sundays than any other day. And yet we're stuck with these contracts which simply don't reflect the reality of today. So I hope when you're speaking to any of the unions or any of the Labour Party, Andy Burnham included, who take money from these unions, who are messing up our railway and messing with people's lives, stopping people from getting to work during the week, many of whom will be the hardest up people in Britain. I hope you'll be saying to them that rather than be conflicted and speak up for the unions, they'll speak up for the travelling public, which is what we're doing and which is why we're requiring these reforms, which deserve support.
OK, as Transport Secretary, I also want to ask you about P&O because, as you will know, they announced sudden redundancies back in March, but its owner has reported a bumper profit. So what's your reaction?
Well, look, as far as P&O are concerned, I've been absolutely crystal clear. I think their boss, the CEO, needs to resign. He's still under investigation, which is absolutely right for the way that he behaved. And we've changed the law with regard to some of the kind of detail of what happened there. And we brought forward a 9-point plan to make sure that no ferry company could do this again, including legislating to make sure that they have to pay the minimum wage when they are frequently in British waters. So P&O are going to have to overturn what they've done here. They will have no choice in law very shortly. They should recognise that and make that change now.
You're backing Rishi Sunak in the Conservative leadership race. Is it time for him to hand in the towel? He's more than 30 points behind in the polls, and the government has urgent business it needs to address with the cost of living crisis. We're told we have to wait for a new Prime Minister for action to be taken.
I mean, we'll know who the new Prime Minister is in a little over 2 weeks. I don't think it would be right for either side to not allow a formal vote to go ahead. And if there's one thing we've learned from the last few years is, I think of the 2015 election. I was party chairman at the time. Everyone said we couldn't win the election. I think of the 2016 Brexit poll where everyone was pretty sure the country was about to vote for Remain. I think it'd be a very good idea to wait for those who are voting in this contest to complete the vote. So it's only just over a fortnight's time, and we'll know the answer to that. In the meantime, many of us are working very hard to make sure that services are available this summer. Is what I've been doing. I haven't been away this summer. I've been looking after the transport system to make sure that people can get away on holiday, for example.
OK, well, Grant Shapps, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed for joining us here on Sky News. Time now to get more on today's strikes. Sky's correspondent Matthew Thompson is at Vauxhall Station for us in South London right now. So Matthew, how's it looking there right now?
Lots of frustrated faces, as you can probably imagine, from bleary-eyed morning commuters this morning, as London Underground workers and Overground workers from the RMT union are joining colleagues, bus drivers from the Unite union, in a series of walkouts that's set to bring much of public transport in the capital to a halt today. Around 10,000 London Underground workers, 400 London Overground workers joining the strikes. Commuters are being urged to work from home if possible, and the disruption is set to last until about 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And it comes really sandwiched in between two other days of strikes. Yesterday, of course, we saw widespread strikes. 1 in 5 train services were cancelled. Tomorrow, yet another day of strikes planned. And, well, what's it all about? You heard some of the arguments rehearsed by the Transport Secretary there. The unions want pay settlements that better reflect the cost of living crisis, the soaring inflation levels, which have hit 40-year highs. They also want guarantees on job security and things like that amidst cuts that the government are proposing. The government, it's determined not to bow to those demands, as you heard from the Transport Secretary there. But another one of the arguments we've heard from the Prime Minister, from the Bank of England, is that they're determined to avoid something called a wage price spiral, which is basically a term economists use for an idea that when inflation rises and demands for wages follow them, you get this vicious circle where wages start chasing prices and inflation gets even worse. Although other economists and certainly the unions have said that is a myth. Certainly the RMT's Mick Lynch has said last night that these strikes will go on as long as it takes, meaning that the summer of discontent could well become an autumn and even a winter too.
Thanks very much indeed for that. We'll, of course, be covering it every step of the way. In the meantime, let's take a look at what's on this morning's front pages, shall we? And the Daily Mail says that 43,000 students have been left scrambling for a place at university after A-level results created what it describes as a clearing frenzy. The Eye reports on a warning from the Office for Budget Responsibility to Tory leadership frontrunner Liz Truss about her spending promises. And Liz Truss also makes the front of the Express with a pledge about new laws to crack down on strike action. The Guardian reports that bonuses for water company bosses were up 20% last year, even though they failed to meet targets on sewage pollution. Now, some breaking news in the last hour or so. A drought has been declared in parts of Wales this morning after the driest 5-month period in 40 years. Natural Resources Wales said that the threshold to trigger drought status in South West Wales has now been met. The areas affected include North Ceredigion, Teifi, Pembrokeshire, Carmarthen, Swansea, Llanelli, Neath, Port Talbot and Bridgend. Well, a hosepipe ban has also come into effect in Pembrokeshire and parts of Carmarthenshire due to the strain on public water supplies. It comes after weeks of hot, dry weather, which has also led to drought being declared and hosepipe bans coming into force in areas of England. And experts are warning that any rain currently forecast is expected to be short and unlikely to change the situation. Well, with parts of the world experiencing extreme weather conditions, let's take a look, shall we, at the impact of climate change on the planet and show you our data dashboard. And on the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see how the UK's power is currently being produced, 45% coming from gas at the moment, for example. Top left, you can see how much warmer the Earth is now than back in 1880, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, that is, and when records began, 1.25 degrees. And finally, at the bottom left is the total amount of CO2 emissions globally that are being pushed out. That's in millions of tonnes, and as you can see, that number going up all the time. Now, do stay with us here on Sky News Breakfast, still to come here on the show. With London's transport largely at a halt from strike action, we'll ask a TfL manager Where next for talks with union leaders? And we'll also check in on the Tory leadership race with Liz Truss backing MP Jacob Berry. And then at 8:30, I'll be joined by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and I'll be asking him where he stands on the demands of striking transport workers. But right now, let's go back to that breaking news we brought you at the beginning of the show, that retail sales rose slightly last month by 0.3%, but more broadly, over the 3 months of July, sales were down by 1.2%. Now, this comes alongside new data this morning showing that consumer confidence has hit an all-time low, faced with soaring prices and a forecast of a recession. Well, Sky's Adele Robinson joins me now from Reading. So, Adele, all eyes on how much spending power people feel that they have, and the news isn't great this morning.
No, it's not great. There was some surprise, though, because economists had predicted a dip similar to June for retail sales. In June, as you said, retail sales went down by 0.2%, but in July they rose by 0.3%. However, as the Office for National Statistics has said, the overall downward trend for retail sales is continuing. If you look a little bit more into the data as well, there are some explanations for that surprising rise in retail sales. The non-store retailing, which basically means online buying, that rose by 4.8%, but it's believed that was driven by promotions that had boosted sales. When you look at clothing and household sales, they were actually down, which shows that people are still cutting back on what they're spending amid concerns over affordability and the cost of living as well. So it does reflect overall an economy that's still grappling with increasing and record food prices, as well as fuel prices over those June and July months as well. But then coupled with the Consumer Confidence Index, which you've just mentioned there, that showed record lows in how people are feeling. And that's calculated in 5 different ways, 5 different measures. And each of those, they look at things like personal finance and also looking at people's attitudes to and their thoughts on the economy over the last year, and then looking ahead. And each of those areas were down as well. In fact, overall, the Consumer Confidence Index fell by 3 points in August, which was the lowest since 1974 when it began. It fell originally back in May of this year to a record low, and each month since it's fallen. In a consumer-led economy like ours, that is bad news. Bad news as well for the shops and the stores behind me here on the High Street in Reading. Not only do they have to contend with those falling overall numbers of retail sales and the consumer confidence, what they have got impending, not just the Bank of England's recession, but as part of that, the price cap in this autumn for energy. It doesn't apply to them, remember. They won't have that. They will have to potentially negotiate their own energy prices, and that, for some of them, will be catastrophic.
Indeed. Difficult times for them. Adele, thanks very much indeed. Let's take a look now at some of the day's other headlines. And a man has been charged with the murder of 87-year-old pensioner Thomas O'Halloran, who was stabbed to death on his mobility scooter earlier this week. Lee Beyer will appear at Willesden Magistrates Court today. It's been revealed that a security flaw could allow hackers to take control of Apple iPhones, iPads, Macs and even some iPod models. The tech giant admits the issue may have been actively exploited. It's put a software update and is urging people to install it straight away. Health leaders say the UK is facing a humanitarian crisis of worsening health outcomes unless the government does more to help with rising energy costs. NHS Confederation has written a letter to ministers saying surging prices mean that people will have to choose between skipping meals to heat their homes or living in poor conditions. The man accused of trying to kill Sir Salman Rushdie has been denied bail during his latest court appearance in New York State. Hadi Matar has been indicted on charges that he stabbed the author at a lecture event last week, leaving him severely wounded. Matar has pleaded not guilty to attempted murder and assault. A judge in the United States says he's willing to publish part of the warrant which was used by the FBI to search the home of former President Donald Trump. In a hearing last night, prosecutors were given a week to submit a copy of the affidavit with proposed redactions for the information they want to keep secret. A New Zealand family has found the bodies of 2 children in suitcases they bought at a storage unit auction. Police believe that the remains of the children, aged between 5 and 10, had been hidden for several years. Now, Ukraine and Russia are again trading accusations as to who's responsible for shelling near Europe's largest nuclear power station. An increasingly alarmed UN wants to demilitarise the area around the Zaporizhzhia plant, but Russia has rejected that proposal. Well, this video, posted on social media yesterday, appears to show Russian military vehicles inside the nuclear plant. Ukrainian engineers are still operating the plant despite the Russian occupation. Well, Sky's Alistair Bunkle is in the southern Ukrainian city of Odessa for us this morning. And Alistair, there's clearly deep concern around this nuclear plant, and it's growing.
Yeah, real concern, particularly today, because Russia has suggested that Ukraine might be planning provocation, some form of attack. Ukraine, though, says that it has intelligence that Russia is going to do the same at the power plant and then blame the Ukrainians. And our colleagues over at NBC News have been reporting sources that say that some of the workers at the plant are being given an impromptu day off today, which obviously is rather an ominous sign. So it is becoming the attention at the moment of the world to making sure that an incident is occurring at the power plant and there is no major radioactive leak as could happen if fighting continues around it. That was what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres discussed with the Turkish president and the Ukrainian president when they met in the west of Ukraine yesterday. Any attempts to try and make the Zaporizhzhia power plant into a demilitarized zone have been rejected. And there doesn't seem to be any progress either in getting independent inspectors in. So it is something of a stalemate at the moment, with urgency increasing. Elsewhere as well, there were reports overnight that an airbase in the west of Crimea was attacked and a number of explosions there. And there were also reports as yet that the bridge over the Kerch Strait, built by Russia after they annexed Crimea in 2014, which connects Crimea with mainland Russia, well, there was a number of drones flying above it and anti-aircraft fire engaged those. So quite a lot of activity again on the Crimean Peninsula. Today, the UN Secretary General will come here to Odessa to visit the one of the rare, probably the only, really, it's fair to say, diplomatic success that has come out of this 6-month war is that deal between the Russians and the Ukrainians to allow grain to leave these ports. He will come down here to look at that, to try and make sure that that deal continues and the shipments are allowed in and out. But I think his thoughts and the thoughts of the world will be on what is happening at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
Indeed, and we'll watch those events very closely today. Alistair, thanks very much indeed. Do stay with us. Coming up on Sky News Breakfast, a year after the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, we're going to hear from 2 people who fled the country. Welcome back. Let's get more now on our top story here this morning, the continuing disruption to public transport as workers in London strike again today. Well, speaking to the programme this morning, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, accused transport unions of prolonging the dispute that's led to nationwide strikes by not putting potential deals to their members. I asked him if the government is shirking its responsibilities to end the worsening standoff.
Well, the people who have to be around the table are the employers and the workers' representatives, in this case, the unions. They're the only people who can settle this strike. Of course, government sets the mandate overall because we have the further wider responsibility for not just how much rail workers are paid, but how much care workers are paid, how much staff in the NHS, doctors and nurses, and police, and so many other public services. So, of course, we have to set an overall framework. The Treasury has done that. In a way, as I say, rail is fortunate. There is so much modernisation required for work practices which have no place in the 21st century at all. I'll give you a good example of this. Is there are the same number of ticket offices, more or less, than there were when virtually all the tickets were sold at ticket offices. We want to get people out from behind the glass and onto the stations, helping customers.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you're saying this has got nothing to do with the government. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to move this on.
And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the government has to set the overall mandate, the framework, but the technical discussions have to take place between the employers and the unions. And they have been. And that's why we've got offers of 8% over 2 years on the table with, as I say, it varies depending on which part of which union and which part of the railway we're talking about, but no compulsory redundancies, for example, with the Network Rail maintenance side, and much more. If the unions won't put the offer to their members, I'm afraid we will have to impose some of these solutions, and that's where we're moving to now.
Well, it's time to say good morning to our political correspondent, Amanda Acas. Hello to you. So Grant Shapps there, no real sign of the government certainly giving any ground on this.
Absolutely, quite bullish language once again from Grant Shapps on this, almost a kind of divide and rule, suggesting that the union barons need to get out of the way of the prospect of a deal being reached with the membership over this offer of around 8% pay increase. Now, of course, as we were hearing from Mick Lynch yesterday, the unions believe that that would be, in real terms, a pay cut. We know inflation is standing at 10.1%. They clearly believe they need to fight for their rights of their members. Indeed, the whole principle of collective responsibility and collective bargaining from the unions is that is their right to be able to do so. And indeed, I think this sense that the government might start imposing some of these modernising practices that are part of these negotiations is also something that will probably inflame tensions. Now, the Conservative Party, the government clearly believe that this is their responsibility. They say they're standing up for working people. Clearly believe that this will go down well with voters. But I think across the country, everyone understands the impact of the cost of living crisis. Everyone is looking at how far their wages will go with concerns about energy bills rising. And so perhaps, as we were hearing from the unions yesterday, we could see a much broader range of industrial action with many more workers in other sectors continuing to call for the same thing. So I think they are on fairly shaky ground on this. Particularly this morning, we're hearing yet more bleak economic indicators, a sense that consumer confidence is its lowest level since record began in the 1970s. We know inflation is continuing to rise. Labour, this is grist to their mill, really, as the kind of Conservative leadership candidates continue to argue about the best way of dealing with this. They're today calling for Parliament to be recalled in order to discuss their plan to freeze the energy price cap, because we know at the end of this month it's likely to go up. We're expecting it to rise to £3,500. Currently, it's just £2,000. Labour say MPs need to discuss what to do about this, and at the moment, the government don't appear to be taking that on board.
Yeah, indeed, and we'll be talking to Labour very shortly, actually. Amanda, thanks very much indeed. Now, families and survivors of online child sexual abuse have written an open letter to Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss asking them to promise to pass the delayed online safety bill. The bill was due to make its way through Parliament before recess, but has been delayed until a new Prime Minister is in place. Sky's Aisha Zahid reports.
Danielle was just 14 when an online children's game led to abuse. She was targeted by a man who claimed to be 16 but was in fact in his late 40s. He used a chat room feature to groom Danielle before arranging to meet her and sexually assaulting her.
He arranged to meet me after school. I got into his car and discovered that he was a lot older than what he was, so I just froze. From that point, he took me to a forest, and that's when this sexual abuse started. And that escalated as he threatened that if I spoke out or told anybody about it, he'd threaten my family. So I felt like I had to see him again. After the third occasions, that got a lot more violent.
Danielle's story is part of a bigger problem. In the last decade, online child sexual abuse cases increased tenfold, according to the NSPCC. The proposed online safety bill aims to help tackle the issue and address wider problems by regulating how online platforms protect users from harmful content. But with the legislation delayed until a new Prime Minister is in place, survivors and campaigners have written an open letter to both candidates, urging Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak to resist calls to water down the bill and commit to delivering it without any more delay.
For every month that the online safety bill is not passed, we can expect to see another 3,500 online child sexual abuse offences recorded by police forces in the UK. But on top of that, if the bill is delayed, we will lose what is to be a really crucial pillar of the fight against online sexual child abuse.
The message they're sending is clear.
By coming together and speaking out, we want the next Prime Minister to know that what happened to us was avoidable, and it's now in their hands to protect our children and to make sure there is safety measures in place for children that are using the internet now.
The online safety bill has been years in the making. People like Danielle have spent even longer raising awareness. Change can't come soon enough. Aisha Zahid, Sky News.
Now, this week marks 1 year since the Taliban took control of Afghanistan. Following their return to power, many Afghans have had to flee the country, fearing for their safety. Among them is Aisha Khurram, a women's rights activist who left her university studies to escape the country in the weeks after the Taliban took control. And I'm very pleased to say that Aisha joins me now from Berlin. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Tell us a little bit about what that was like. A lot of young people live in Afghanistan. It's got one of the highest proportions of young people in the world. So what was it like? What's it like to live under the Taliban as a young person there?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Well, actually, I was born as a refugee 2 years before the 9/11, and I returned back to my homeland when it was emerging back from the rebels of war and also the repressive regime of Taliban. And after 2001, I was fortunate enough to go to school, and I was able to continue my higher education and be enrolled in one of the biggest public universities in Afghanistan and study political science. And today, after 22 years of all the progress, of all the transformation that we have witnessed in the country, we are back to the ground zero. We are back to the point we have started from. And the day when I received the call not to leave home to university, it was the day when the Taliban took over, and that was exactly the day when a lot of university professors, they have said specifically goodbye to female students, and it was one of the saddest and the most shocking and the most shattering moments of my whole life. And the fact that Taliban were taking over the country and at the same time seeing how the international community and our own republic government, they have betrayed the people of Afghanistan. It changed the life of the younger generation for the worse. And today, families are torn apart, and people staying back in Afghanistan, they are either trying to choose between migration or starvation, and there is no choice in between for them.
And very briefly, what hope do you have for the future of Afghanistan?
Well, actually, since I came to Germany and when I got involved in activities to help my people back home, when I've tried to continue my activism, since we are providing healthcare services for women and children in Afghanistan, I have seen in the past few months thousands of children dying in front of us who wouldn't have died last year this time for the reasons that was so easily avoidable. And today, with the whole state of statelessness, with the country being on the brink of starvation, and with the insecurities rising in the oppression of Taliban choking the Afghan nation, I think the most important thing for us, at least at the international level, would be to change the narrative. Afghanistan is not a failed nation. The political failure is an undeniable reality, but the Afghan youth are not failed. And if there is any force that can stand against oppression, and that could be a force for justice and democracy in Afghanistan, that is the Afghan youth, and they are not failed today.
OK, we must leave it there. But Aisha Khurram, a real pleasure to talk to you this morning. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Let's stay with the situation in Afghanistan. I'm now joined by Mohammed Hakmal, a former chief of public health in Afghanistan who had to flee Taliban rule. A very good morning to you. Perhaps we should start with why you had to flee. Tell us what happened to you. I know it might be difficult for you, but as much as you're happy to talk about.
Well, thank you very much, John, for having me. I left like many other Afghans because of this conflict in the country, and because many people also, specifically those that they were in a senior position, they were targeted, and I was one of them, So because of several limitations and also several challenges, I left the country. I know leaving the country is not an easy decision for anyone. But sometimes, when it comes between life and death, so you need to select, one of the options that at least you can survive.
Well, yes, and I know that you had a very difficult time at the hands of the Taliban, but let's talk about the work that you were doing in Afghanistan and how frustrating it is for you to not be able to continue that now.
Well, as my other friends, fellow Afghans, Aisha mentioned, so today the situation in Afghanistan is really painful because we are seeing people, they are dying from the preventable cause. From very simple, measures that these people's life could be also safe. And unfortunately, we are also looking to the international commitments, community commitments. So what they are saying, they are not putting in action. So with the conflict, that we are also seeing in Ukraine, Afghanistan is not, unfortunately, in the headlines. It's not because the situation has been improved, because Afghanistan is politically, I think, not in the location that should be also discussed in the media. And we are also seeing people, that they are not being able, to apply for the scholarship to get education abroad, So Afghan youths are also has been, unfortunately, these days also deprived of the education, not only inside the country, but outside the country as well. Let me give one example of UK. UK government has also funding, this tuning scholarship. And unfortunately, our people this year, so the young generations, they will not be able, to apply for the scholarship. It's not only UK, in several other governments. So they were providing educational opportunity during the last 2 decades. But these days, because of the crisis, and it's not only, limitation inside the country, it's outside the country. Okay. We are also being deprived, from most of the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, Mohammed Hakmal, we appreciate you talking to us this morning and telling us about your experience. Thanks very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Now, Labour is calling for Parliament to be recalled on Monday to urgently discuss the cost of living crisis. The shadow leader of the House of Commons, Thangam Debonair, has written to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the 2 candidates who are vying to replace him. And I'm very pleased to say that she joins me now. A very good morning to you. So you've proposed your energy price plan. You now want Parliament recalled. But we have in the past weeks heard from the Liberal Democrats, the SNP and Gordon Brown wanting Parliament to be recalled. Are you a bit late to this?
No, I mean, I think the most important thing is that households are worrying now. And because the Ofgem price rise is due to be announced in 7 days' time, the government has failed to come up with their own plan. And we announced our plan, which is now fully, it's fully costed. We know where we're going to get the money. We're going to take the money from those big oil and gas producers who have so benefited from the windfall in oil and gas prices. And we need to get back to Parliament on Monday so that we can legislate before the Ofgem price rise. The time to act is now. The government has failed. They could have acted weeks ago. They could have acted months ago, in fact, when Labour first called for a windfall tax on oil and gas way back in January. And that is why, under our plan, we would backdate that windfall tax and close the loophole that the government put in their energy price levy. We would backdate it all the way back to January, because nobody can say that we haven't warned the oil and gas companies that their massive profits at a time of national crisis with inflation skyrocketing have to be used to help households through this very difficult time.
But what would a debate achieve when we're just 2 weeks away from having a new Prime Minister announced and they will have a plan of their own?
what it would achieve, would it be to pass a law? It wouldn't be just so that we could discuss it. It would be so that we can pass the legislation that would be necessary for us to override the price rise, the rise in the price cap that Ofgem will be announcing in 7 days' time. That could happen next week if we get back to Parliament on Monday. That is up to the government to request the Speaker, and they can do that. The Prime Minister is perfectly capable of opening his email, which I sent to him last night, asking him to do just this. I've also asked both leadership candidates to back that call. If they're really serious about helping working people and struggling households and businesses through this crisis, through this cost of living crisis, they should back our call right now, and we should be passing that legislation next week.
Well, yes, obviously you think it's the best plan, but not everybody else does. There are a lot of people out there that say it's very expensive and it's only a short-term fix. As soon as you release that freeze on the price cap, inflation will just shoot up again.
Well, what we're focusing on is what's going to help people right now. And we do know where we're going to get the money for that plan. And as I said, we are going to concentrate primarily on getting the money back from the oil and gas producers who are making massive windfall profits and have been for some time now. That's how we'd pay for it. It would help those people, for example, those 4 million households who are on prepayment meters where they have to feed a meter with cash and top it up at the local shop if they run out. And I've watched this happen with struggling working families who have been put on a prepayment meter and they run out of power because that power costs much more than it does for those people on bills and direct debits. Now, we would fix that gap with our plan, and we would also keep the price cap from rising, so that would save most households around £1,000. Now, yes, we'll need a long-term plan as well. Labour does have a long-term plan, and I would like us to get into government sooner rather than later, so we can insulate homes, invest in renewable energy, protect our energy security, and conduct that green energy sprint that this country and our planet so badly needs. But right now, we have to focus on what's in front of people right now and their worries for how they're going to get through the winter, whether or not they're going to be able to afford to heat and eat. And that's the stark choice we're facing. And the government needs to do the right thing, get us back to Parliament and legislating.
We're in the midst of rail strikes once again. Are you happy with Keir Starmer's stance on this, discouraging members from going to the picket lines? Are you on the side of working people in Labour anymore?
Of course we're on the side of working people. Labour believes in the right to strike, and we also know that constituency MPs should and do always listen to the needs and views of our constituents, and we do. My job as a member of Keir's shadow cabinet is to prepare to get us into government so that we can pass in the first 100 days that employment bill, that workers' rights charter that would so benefit people who are right now calling out for help, and understandably so. That's our role in the Labour movement. That employment bill is something that Angela Rayner has worked on with the trade unions, and it would protect the right to bargain, it would protect the right to fair pay, it would end the unfair practices of fire and rehire that are damaging people's lives.
Very briefly, you're about to fall off air. Would you go on a picket line or not?
That's not my role. My role is actually to listen to my constituents and to work on the legislation that would help prevent the need for strikes to take place in the first place.